I apologize for my voice. I sound a bit like under the weather frog or something like that. I was sick about a week and a half ago, and it just won't go away. Congestion just keeps coming back, but I assume we all know what that feels like. I know we love family here in Rosedale Conference. And so I wanted to introduce you to my family. First, I'm Kelsey Jurkovich. I work at Fairlawn Mennonite Church in Apple Creek, Ohio. I've been there for 9 years. And my chief responsibilities are over adult discipleship and education, a large portion of that being devoted to our small group ministry that we call discipleship groups. Keith is on the planning committee, and I assume it was an easy ask for him to ask me to do this. So I wanted to introduce you to my family. There they are. My wife rarely ever gets to come to these. It was Pastor's Conference was at Fairlawn last year, so she got to be a part of that a little bit. But my oldest son is Ezra, there on the right. My second is Silas on the left, very far left. And then the crazy one in the orange shirt, number 3 is Zeke. And then Sam, number 4. 9, 7, 4, and 2, almost 2. So the oldest 2 are biological, and the 2 youngest are adopted. They're sweet. I love them to death. But that's just a little bit about me, who I am, and I'm hoping this morning as we consider this topic of small groups that it can be beneficial. And to be honest with you, I struggled a little bit to put this content together because this is a very broad kind of topic. Small groups has a lot of different facets and a lot of different places that you can go, and also a lot of places that you guys are coming from that are different than where I am. And so in some ways, I struggled to determine what exactly are we going to cover here that will ultimately be helpful to all of you. And so I did my best, and I'm going to lay it out here, the trajectory that we're going to be on this morning or this afternoon. But before we do that, I'd like to know just a little bit more about who I'm talking to and what situations you guys are coming from. We're too big of a group to do personal introductions, so I've got a couple questions, and I just want a raise of hands that will help me a little bit. So how many of you in here represent those who have a small group ministry in your church already? Raise your hand. Okay, most of you, that's awesome. Those of you who don't have a small group ministry, but you're here because you want to learn more about actually starting one. Okay, very good. And then those of you who just realized that you're in the wrong breakout. Okay, perfect. That would be your time to exit if you realize that. So what I want to do with our time together is look at two realities. The first is what I'm calling universal biblical principles. So there's some principles that we see in Scripture that I think should be universal, and that is should be present in every small group. No matter what size your church is, no matter what focus your small group has, no matter your context, there should be these universal biblical principles represented in your groups in order for them to be healthy. And then we're going to look, secondly, at some contextual elements and looking at the idea of individual contexts in our churches and how those elements differ. And what we're ultimately hoping to do is to bring these things together, bring together these universal biblical principles with our context in order to create a healthy and, Lord willing, effective small group ministry. So some of this is going to be pretty broad, pretty big picture, but I'm hoping that it can grab on and take hold in your context as well. And so once we walk through those two kind of big headings, what I want to do is just spend some time showing you how we at Fairlawn have answered some of the context-specific questions that we'll be asking, and I'd love some interaction as we go along here as well. I love question and answers. I'm going to give you guys the opportunity for that. But if we're going along here and you have questions, please raise your hand. That's the way we're going to learn the best here. If I can answer concrete questions for you. But I'll also give some space for that as well as we go throughout. Those of you who have already walked in, do you have a handout? Is anybody in here doesn't have a handout? Okay. I'm going to send them back again. What the outline is that you have in front of you is basically just kind of the big picture of what we're going to be covering. If you want to take notes, you can. If you don't, that's fine. I'm just hoping that throughout this you can learn some tidbits as we go along that will help you in your small group ministry. So let's start out with looking at what I have as 4 biblical principles, universal biblical principles, that I think need to be evident in every small group, no matter what context you find yourself in. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. I think that we probably know a lot of these already, and then I'll give you guys a chance to talk amongst yourselves about them a little bit. So the first biblical principle is prioritizing leaders over programs. So getting the right leaders versus getting the right programs for our small group ministry. If you notice Jesus' ministry, when he goes public, he begins by choosing people, not by creating programs, right? He begins by picking out the leaders who are ultimately going to take the principles that he teaches them and put flesh around them later in the life of the church. They're going to, in a certain sense, take what Jesus teaches them and put some of that into programs and structures for the church to thrive under at a later point. But Jesus begins his ministry with people, with getting the right leaders in the right places. Now, this doesn't mean that structure is not important. This doesn't mean that programs are not important. This doesn't mean that whatever you think of when you hear small group in your context, that the structural elements are not important. All of those things are vital, and they're extremely important. But what's most important is not how things are structured, not when you meet, not what the focus is. Those are important, but what's most important is who's leading them, and how are you cultivating those people who are leading them. So this is the first step that I think needs to be a priority in every one of our small group ministries, that we should be more focused on the people who are leading that ministry or those groups than we should be on the structure of the ministry itself. Second, we want to empower and equip leaders to lead. This one we're going to spend a little bit more time on and look at some scriptures here. So under empower and equipping these leaders, so we need to identify who these leaders are going to be of these small groups, and then we need to do our due diligence to equip them to actually do their job effectively and to do it well. And we see this throughout the Gospels. The first subpoint under this is to give ownership to those leaders. So Luke 9, 1 and 2, it says, "And Jesus called the 12 together and gave them power and authority over the demons and to cure diseases. And he sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal." So before Jesus sends out his disciples, he gives them power and authority. He gives them ownership. He gives them what they need in order to accomplish the goals and the mission that he sent them out to do. Now, this is a necessary step in our small group ministries as well. If they're going to be effective, we need to give our leaders the ownership, the power and authority that they need to lead their groups as they see best. Now, we're going to see that this doesn't mean that there's no oversight over these leaders, that there's no accountability between you as the pastor and whoever might be leading these small groups. There definitely is. But we need to be able to hand over a certain degree of authority and ownership to these leaders to lead these groups as they see fit and as the Lord is leading them to lead. So the first step under empower and equip leaders to lead is to give ownership. The second one is to train them for the work of the ministry. If you were to open your Bible to any point in the gospel, any point in the Gospels, there's a very, very good chance that you're going to find Jesus teaching at that point, wherever you lay your finger down in the Gospels. The entire teaching ministry of Jesus, the entire life of Jesus, is in the context of teaching, in the context of him communicating principles and truths to his disciples that they are then going to take and use to equip and train and lead others to Jesus. So embodying this and embracing this as pastors, we need to be diligent to be doing the same thing with these leaders. We need to be taking our understanding of who Jesus is and transmitting that to them and teaching them how to effectively lead their small groups. This is the pattern that we see in Jesus' ministry, and this kind of formal, intentional training is crucial to having a healthy small group ministry. Your leaders have to be equipped to do what they've been asked to do. There's not a whole lot so a fast track to unhealthy small groups is saying, putting a leader there who you're not intentionally training and just saying, go at it. And maybe you have experienced that in the way that your small groups have been run before, but more often than not, unless they're an exceptional case, more often than not, that's the fast track to a lot of problems and a lack of health. So there needs to be this, what I call this formal ministry training. And when I say formal, that doesn't mean, seminary or Bible college or anything like that. It means intentionally teaching these leaders how to conduct the ministry of their small group. Whatever that looks like for your small group, and we'll talk more about that later, you need to be training them how to do it, not just assuming that they know how to do it. Now, there's an important distinction here that I like to make and that we reflect at Fairlawn as well. And that is the distinction between ministry training, that is training them to know how to do what you're asking them to do in their small groups, and spiritual development of the leaders. We need both. We need both to be developing these leaders spiritually and to develop them in relation to what they have been called to do in their specific small groups. When we're training leaders, I think that it can be very easy for us to focus on one or the other. We want to develop and cultivate the spiritual life of these leaders. That's great, that's awesome, that's necessary. But then we might kind of neglect actually teaching them how to lead well. Or oftentimes it's the other direction, where we neglect their personal spiritual development and we instead put all of our efforts into, this is the way you need to lead, this is what you need to be doing, this is how you need to be doing it. If our small group leaders are going to be healthy, we need both of those training emphases coming together in one. And we actually see this also in the ministry of Jesus. Go figure, right? Not only is Jesus intentionally teaching his disciples about the kingdom, that they are then going to take and transmit that, and they're going to minister in the way that Jesus taught them, but we also see Jesus emphasizing the spiritual growth of his disciples. And one of the most beautiful, I know that is really small, at least on my screen. Oh, okay, it's not that bad back there. One of the most beautiful times that we see this is when Jesus is with Peter after the resurrection, right? Let me read this for you. John 21, 15 through 17. And when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Feed my lambs." He said to him a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And he said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was grieved because he said to him a third time, "Do you love me?" And Peter said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." We see the connection there between Peter's three denials of Jesus and Jesus's affording him the opportunity to express that commitment and love to Jesus 3 times. What's Jesus doing here? He's telling him, "Feed my sheep," right? You have a ministry that I'm calling you to do and that I'm sending you out on. But before I'm sending you out on that mission, I need to know that you love me, right? That's spiritual development. That's checking the heart of Peter before he sends him out to tend to the sheep that Jesus has just died to purchase. Jesus is preparing to send Peter out as a fisher of men, but before he does so, he asks him 3 times, "Where's your heart? Do you love me more than these? Do you love me more than anything else?" So this is just one of the examples of where we see Jesus doing this, but Jesus had an intentional focus on training, not only ministry training, here's how you need to do what I'm calling you to do, but also that spiritual development of his disciples, tending to their hearts and helping them to grow and helping them to grow in their own love for Jesus, even as they seek to then go out and minister to others in the same way. So the point here is our leaders don't just need to know how to get the job done. They need that. They need to know those things. They need ministry training in that way. But they also need to have the "where is your heart at" shepherding. And that should come from us as pastors. That should come from us as their pastor. We are shepherding them. We are equipping them to do the work of ministry that we are asking them to do. So in order for those leaders that we are seeking out and prioritizing to be healthy, we need to train them to do what we're calling them to do, and we need to help them to develop spiritually so that they can lead in integrity and with a deep love for Jesus. Okay, first 2 principles: prioritize leaders over programs, and then empower and equip leaders to lead. Give ownership, train them for the ministry, and then develop them spiritually. Number 3, align your small group ministry culture with the culture of your church. Mark 12, 28 through 31, Jesus says this, "And one of the scribes came up and heard them disputing with one another, and seeing that he answered them well, he asked, 'Which commandment is the most important of all?' Jesus answered, 'The most important is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these.'" If you were to analyze the ministry of Jesus, his ministry is defined by these 2 values and priorities, loving God and loving others. We recognize that. We're all pastors. We get this. This is what Jesus' ministry was based upon. We could call this, in modern parlance, the core values of Jesus' ministry. Love God and love others. Jesus' ministry and the ministry that his disciples then embrace are aligned perfectly with these 2 values. It's very interesting when you look at the rest of the New Testament. I want to look at just a couple verses just to demonstrate this for you. Everybody who, well, depending on who you think the author of Hebrews is, everybody besides Jude embraces at some point in their writings, covering the rest of the New Testament letters outside of the Gospels, everybody embraces at some point, Paul, Peter, John, whoever wrote Hebrews, with the exception of Jude, embraces in some form or manner the exact language that we see here to love God and to love others, showing that Jesus' teaching ministry sunk down into his disciples and that they were replicating those values. They were exercising their ministry under the same values that Jesus instilled in them. Romans, so we'll take Paul as an example here. Romans 13, 8 and 9. I should just have Matt back there recite it for you because he just preached on this a couple weeks ago. Romans 13, 8 and 9 says, Paul says this, if I can find it. He says, "Owe no one anything except to love each other. For the one who loves one another has fulfilled the law." Does this sound familiar? "For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself." A direct quote from Jesus, of course, right? So this encompasses most of the letters of the New Testament, with the Apostle Paul being in alignment with what Jesus taught, with this core value of love God, love others. Hebrews 13:1 says, "Let brotherly love continue." Love your neighbor, love one another. We see that represented in Hebrews. James chapter 2, verse 8 says, "If you really fulfill the royal law according to the scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself." In quotations, you are doing well. Again, quoting from Jesus. 1 Peter 4:8 says, "Above all, keep loving one another earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sins." This is the most important commandment that I give to you, that you love God and that you love one another. None are greater than these. And then we know 1 John is, John's a love guy. He talks about love all the time in his letters. 1 John 4:21 says, "And this commandment we have from him, whoever loves God must also love his brother." Do you see what I'm saying here? Jesus charted out values that he wanted the kingdom of God to embrace, and he needed his apostles to embrace those same values and to transmit them. There was an alignment between Jesus, the master, and his disciples in relation to what they were seeking to accomplish and what they were carrying on. Love God and love one another. So in this little analogy, you could say that Jesus is the church at large. Your church are the values that you have as a church being embraced. Is there alignment there in your small group ministry and their focus and their emphasis, and with the values of your church as a whole? If you're going to be healthy as a whole, if your small groups are going to be healthy, and if that's going to bolster and build up the culture of your church, these things need to be in alignment. Our leaders need to understand and embody the values of the church in their individual groups. Without this alignment, the leaders and their groups will struggle with their purpose and gauging their progress. They will struggle with their purpose and gauging their progress if there's not this alignment. Okay. One more, and then I want you guys to talk amongst each other a little bit, because after lunch sessions are rough. Number 4, rely on the Spirit to bring the fruit. 1 Corinthians 3, 5 through 7, Paul says, "What then is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants through whom you believed, as the Lord assigned to each. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth." This is an essential principle that needs to be reflected in every single small group. That it doesn't matter how good of leaders you have. It doesn't matter how perfect your structure is. It doesn't matter how perfectly it matches your church context and your church community. If Jesus is not making it grow, it's not going to grow. And so this, I think, reinforces within us the necessity as pastors who are overseeing this ministry to be dependent upon the Holy Spirit to bring that growth. Creating an effective, this is not a formulaic kind of thing. I'm giving you biblical principles and contextual elements to help you think strategically about how to do things well. But God needs to be the one who takes those things and produces growth. We labor, we plant, we train, we develop leaders, we structure our ministries appropriately, but at the end of the day, we must trust God to give the fruit from all of our labors. This shouldn't make us slothful in doing our jobs well. It should make us confident that as we do, He's going to bless those things and we're going to see fruit. Our objective here as pastors is to make sure that we're doing our jobs with biblical excellence and then entrusting the results of those things to the Lord and allowing Him to do what He will with those ministries, with those leaders, and the people that they are leading. Okay, 4 biblical principles: prioritize leaders over programs, empower and equip leaders to lead. Number 3, align your small group ministry culture with the culture of the church. And then number 4, rely on the Spirit to bring the fruit in your ministry. Now, what I want to do is I want you guys talking amongst each other. I see some nodding off, and that's okay. I do that myself. But I want you guys to get some blood flowing again. So I want you to discuss this, break up into 2s, 3s, 4s, whatever you want to do, and just talk about these 4 biblical principles. You can handle either one of these, or you can just talk about whatever you want to talk about with them. That's fine too. But the 2 things I have on here is which biblical principle hit home with you the most and why. And you can kind of define hit home with you however you want, most impactful, you think most necessary, whatever. And then number 2, would you add a principle that wasn't on this list? I want to hear from you if I'm missing anything on this point. So take a few minutes, just organize yourselves and chat a little bit about those 2 things. take about a minute to wrap up that conversation. All right, let's bring it back together. I'd like to hear a little bit from you guys about your conversation here. Matt's running the mic, so just raise your hand. Am I missing anything, or some thoughts or even questions that you have about these universal biblical principles?
I don't know if you're missing anything or not. We didn't get that far, but
That's good.
But
That's why I put it second.
but I know for me personally, the missing part of our small group ministry is the training of the leaders, and that falls on me. And I feel like I'm not sure, I don't feel very well equipped to train them. I feel like I need either resources or something that I can get my hands on, to something practical to give them. You know, I feel comfortable. This is very helpful, by the way, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I feel comfortable on the in terms of the spiritual development piece, but the training piece for the other part of the groups is where I'm weak and feel like I need some tools to help me in that.
Sure.
So if anybody knows of stuff, I'm all ears.
Yeah.
Yes, I am here in this session because I will learn and go back to Pakistan and train our pastors about small groups in Pakistan.
Okay.
So it's really helping me, and I was asking more in my group how we can get more training, more material to train pastors in Pakistan, because we don't have training. Even most of the pastors in Pakistan have no Bible school, no training. They just come from the discipleship of their pastor and start church planting, things like that.
Okay.
And most of the pastors don't have much education. My father was a pastor for 50 years, and his education was under primary. But he made like 30 disciples which are full-time in ministry now. So that's a need in Pakistan, so what I'm learning is going to be very helpful.
Good. Well, thank you for being here. I appreciate you sharing. The reason why I'm neglecting to answer these two questions is because I do feel like some of the training element is somewhat contextual as well, right? And so I would definitely love, I'm going to show you a little bit of how we've embraced that training side at Farallon in our small group ministry, and that could be helpful to spur some things in your minds. But I would love to have a personal conversation with you guys to learn more about your context, to be able to be more intentional with an answer in that regard. But any other thoughts or questions? I know this is like the principal stage, right? This isn't like put flesh on it yet. We're getting there, and I'm sure there's probably going to be more questions in that space. So, yes.
Can you say a little bit more about number 3, aligning small group ministry culture with the culture of the church? Are you referring to like aligning people based on cultural like connection, or more cultural values of the church bringing them down? I might have missed that when you said it the first time. I
Yeah.
apologize, but-
No, that's all right. It definitely the latter in terms of the core values or the things that you as a church have decided. These are things that we are orienting our community around. Again, you'll see an example of that when we move on here with our church. But yeah, I think that as much as possible, and this doesn't just go for small groups, this goes for our churches as a whole. We want our churches, if we're trying to move in a specific direction, right? If we're trying to move toward loving God and loving others better, if that's our goal, then we want as best as possible all of the ministries of our church to be pushing in that same direction, right? The last thing we want is for our vision and purpose as a church to be love God and love others, and then we've got a small group over here that's gone rogue and is just doing something all on its own. That doesn't foster a sense of building that culture of the church that helps it thrive and be healthy. Does that make sense? Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for sharing. Let's move on to the contextual elements, because I think, again, this will be a broader point of questions here. So again, we're looking at the idea of taking these biblical principles that should be in every small group or every small group ministry, and then these contextual elements that will almost be different for every single church that's represented here. So this is going to be the one where you have to do a lot of individual thinking about your specific church in order for these contextual elements to be helpful. And so what I've done is I've kind of stated a category to think about, which is your numbered number 1, and then ask some what I call context-specific questions about that category. There are probably other questions that could be asked. There's going to be other elements to consider. I just couldn't talk about all of them, so I isolated it to 6 and some questions for you to consider on some of the most important ones. This is probably going to be most helpful to those of you who are here, the few who raised your hand when you said, we don't have a small group ministry, but we want to start one. This is going to be very helpful for you in your laying the foundation of thinking about your ministry in that way. For those of you who already have a small group ministry that's operating, this is probably going to be looking at tweaking some things in order to make them better. We're just going to walk fairly quickly through these elements, and then I want to give you guys some time to think about them for your own church context. So the first contextual element that, in keeping with our biblical principles, that I think is one of the most important is who's going to lead them. Who's going to lead these small groups, right? If we're prioritizing people over programs, this has to be one of the first questions that we ask and answer about our own church. So the question that you can ask yourself, a context-specific question, is first of all, is it going to be pastors and elders who are leading these, or some type of, I'm not sure what your structure is, but we're under an elder-pastor structure at Fairlawn, so that's the language we use. Are you going to isolate those leaders to elders or pastors or deacons? Are you going to isolate or allow members to lead those groups, just general members, regular attenders? Who are you going to allow to lead those groups is the question that we're asking here. And some of the ways in which you might go about answering that particular question is, what is your goal for the leaders of these groups? Are you looking to use these groups and their leadership in them as a way to develop them as leaders? Or would you rather stick somebody in there who's already pretty polished? There's different motivations, different aspects to think about as it relates to the overall health of your church in relation to who's going to be leading these groups. I think naturally we think we want our best guys leading those groups. We want our best people in those groups so that they'll thrive. One of the things that I've recognized, particularly for Fairlawn, is that these can be really healthy spaces if we're intentional as pastors about training and developing. These can be really healthy places for people to serve, to help them develop skills in leadership and in ministry. But again, you have to answer that question for your own context. Second, how will we equip these leaders to grow and faithfully lead their groups? Again, this is an implication of empower and equip them to lead. How much ownership will we give these leaders? What will we control as pastors, and what will we give them the freedom to do in terms of their groups? When will we train these leaders? How will we both train them to lead well? That's that formal training, ministry training, but also help develop them spiritually as leaders and as followers of Christ themselves. How and when are we going to accomplish the training element of developing these leaders and getting them ready to lead? Number 3, what should be the focus of your small groups? So the context-specific question would be, what does your church need to grow in? Do they need small groups that are oriented a lot around study, biblical understanding and knowledge? Do they need groups that are geared around relationships and community? Do you need groups in your church that are oriented around outreach? Now, some groups can embrace a lot of these different elements, but you could have an intentional focus on what you're trying to achieve from these small groups. This is an important contextual question that is going to differ from congregation to congregation. When we started the system of small groups that we currently have, a lot of it was geared around community and that personal relational connection, because we're a church of 500 to 600 in regular attendance on a Sunday. And so we were like, whoa, we're growing. We need to figure out how to keep relational connection amongst each other, right? And so small groups was an intentional way to do that. But I know there's a lot of churches in here that you're like, our church is a small group, and that's okay. Answering this question or these questions is going to look different for you. Number 4, what values should your small group be oriented around? So again, back to the question that was asked, the context-specific questions you can ask here. What core values does your church operate under? Whether those are stated explicitly or simply lived values. Which of these values do you want your small group ministry to embody and to carry on? How are you creating that alignment between the broader church and this small group ministry to keep them driving in the same direction? Number 5, when should your small groups meet? That's a very important question. Context specific, you can ask, what are the regular rhythms of your church's life? Is it most natural for them to meet on Sunday mornings, Sunday evenings, Wednesday evenings? All of that's going to depend on your church culture, your community culture, the other things your church has going on. Again, something that you need to consider and answer for your church context. And then number 6, how should the small groups be divided? And on the outline here and on the PowerPoint, I actually swapped these questions because I think I got them backwards and didn't realize it. So the core question should be, will we prioritize stage of life or multi-generational groups? And then the more context-specific question would be, does your church have enough age diversity to divide into age stage? Or are you seeking to prioritize a multi-generational feel in those groups? And you want to stay away from dividing up by age stage is also an appropriate way to ask that question. So these are what I feel like are some of the core foundational, there's many more probably that could be asked, but these are some of the foundational contextual questions that we need to ask as pastors of the churches that we're in, and answer these questions in order for them, these groups, to fit into the culture that we have, while also marrying that to these universal biblical principles. So what I want to do is give you guys, again, a little bit of time. This is going to be a little bit different. I have personal reflection and or discussion. If you're here by yourself as the pastor or with your wife, you can discuss. If you're here by yourself, you can just kind of think through these things and look at these questions and maybe start to answer some of them for your own context. And so if you're here with your spouse or with somebody else from your church that you can discuss. If you're here by yourself, I want you to look through these 6 questions and start to just answer some of them for your own context as best you can, or just jot down some ideas, jot down some thoughts on the way that this could find a fulfillment in your specific church context. What changes would you make based on these biblical principles and the contextual elements maybe to what you already have going on? So spend a few minutes doing that, and then we'll come back again. Take a minute to wrap up those conversations. All right, let's bring it back together here. I want to hear from you guys a little bit. Thoughts, questions that you have about these particular contextual elements. Okay. So what I want to do with the rest of our time here is to take these same 6 contextual questions and show you how we've answered them at our church. And I'm hoping that that will bring a little bit of light to some of this is still kind of theoretical fog in the air here, and try to put a little bit of flesh onto what answering these questions looks like, at least in our context. I'll refer you to the backside of your outline there under Fairlawn Mennonite Contextual Answers. This is the extent of my PowerPoint presentation, so I actually have word for word on that page what I'm going to be covering, so just go ahead and look at that as we walk through here. After the first 3, I'll take a break and see if you guys have any questions. And then we'll go through the last 3 and do the same. So for the first question of who will lead these groups, elders, pastors, members, what is the goal for the leadership of these groups? We chose to primarily utilize other men outside of our pastors and elders to lead our small groups. We have, I think, 12 or 13, I should probably know that because I am in charge of all of them. 12 or 13 of these small groups in our church, and each group has at least 2 leaders in it, and there are a few that have 3. So that's like, I think there's 32, 33 leaders in these ministries. And the vast majority of them are not pastors or elders. There are a couple that are led by 2 of our elders, but the rest are members that we use there. And this is partly because we don't have that many pastors and elders to run 13 of these groups, but it's also because we do have an intentional focus on using our small group ministry as a way of developing future leaders. And the intentional focus that we have here is to organize these small groups in such a way so as to practically train and allow these leaders to lead in a capacity that an elder or pastor would. So I really view these small groups as micro churches inside of our big church, and I'm really training them to be future elders and pastors in our church or elsewhere. And so that's the vein through which we view and kind of decided who are we going to put in these roles. That was a part of the equation there. And again, if you have a hand to raise along the way here, feel free to do so. Number 2, how will we equip these leaders to grow and faithfully lead their groups? How much ownership will we give these leaders? When will we train them? How will we train them? So our leaders are really confined by some very minimal requirements. We give these leaders a lot of freedom to lead their groups. We give them what I would call guardrails, and we'll see that later here when we talk about the core values that they are meant to filter what they're doing through in their ministry. The core values that we place over them is kind of like the guardrails or the broad structure for the direction we want them going in their small groups. We have very few requirements in terms of we want them prioritizing on a Sunday morning when they meet, discussing the previous week's sermon or some independent study, a time of sharing and prayer. And those are some broad guidelines, but the way in which they do those things, they have a lot of freedom in. We empower them and equip them to execute that ministry well.
So I assume this is a contextual question, but why does Fairlawn choose to do it Sunday mornings, just out of curiosity?
Partially because that's when everybody's there. No, yeah. In all seriousness, there's a lot more buy-in on Sunday mornings, and actually, I know that as some churches grow larger, they tend to go away from. There's a rogue phone over there. I don't know, but that's okay. Somebody want to as churches grow larger, we've noticed, at least in our area, that they do away with like adult stuff on Sunday mornings. It's typically just services. And they don't normally have small groups or other things for the adults. But that was just like, this is built into the culture of our church to do this on Sunday mornings. Now, I will say that these groups are a mixture of what you might look at as, I don't know what we would call them uniformly in this context, but like adult classes on a Sunday morning. They're like a mixture between that and like a community group or a life group. In that this same group that meets on a Sunday morning is encouraged to meet outside of Sunday morning in different settings to cultivate community and to grow in different ways. And so we're kind of morphing the idea of a typical Sunday school hour with a community or life group kind of feel. But in large part, there's the most buy-in on a Sunday morning, and it's already ingrained in the culture.
What's like the approximate size of like your framework for minimum, maximum size of these groups, or is that variable for you guys?
Yeah, we don't like any of these groups to have a regular attendance on a Sunday morning of over 20. So we feel like our sweet spot is anywhere from 15 to that 20 threshold is kind of where we want them to be. Now I will say that every roster is, every regular attendance Sunday is about 60% of the total roster. And so if you've got 20 people showing up on average, the roster of that whole group is, 35, something like that. And nobody ever shows up all at the same time. They're serving, or they're gone, or they're sick, or whatever. But in terms of Sunday morning attendance, we want those groups to be somewhere between 15 and 20 or less.
All right, so is there a set time, like small groups meet from 9 to 9:45, or do you choose as a group when you will meet Sunday morning?
Yeah, Sunday morning there's two options. So we do mirroring services at Farallon, which means everybody shows up at 9 o'clock. Half of the people go to the sanctuary with their children for the first service, and half of the people go to children's ministry, youth ministry, and to their discipleship groups. That goes from 9 to 10:10, and then there's a 20-minute gap from 10:10 to 10:30 where everybody switches. And then we go from 10:30 to 11:40. So they're baked in. You're either in one or the other. And then you can meet outside of Sunday mornings as well. Okay. Still working on point 2 here of what kind of freedom are we giving these leaders? We're giving them a lot of freedom because our philosophy is they know how to best disciple their peers who they're leading. And they don't need me telling them how they need to. They don't need me telling them how they need to lead their group of 65 to 75-year-olds. They know how to do that. We're training them how to do that well. They know how to apply those principles to their peers, and we're giving them the freedom to do that. So very minimal regulations with intentional training and guidance in applying those principles and trainings. So the way we do our trainings, we do our formal trainings, which are geared specifically around that category of how to do your job well, how to lead a discussion, how to lead a prayer time, how to care for people, how to cultivate community and fellowship amongst your group, those kinds of training elements. We do quarterly on Sunday mornings, I'll leave it at that. If you want more specifics, we can talk. And then, so that's the formal training side, the ministry training side, and then the spiritual development side. What we do for that is also on a quarterly basis, ideally the off quarter of the formal trainings. We have all of these leaders in small pod groups that each one of our pastors oversees. And they will meet with us as a group of leaders, 5 or 6 of them, And we'll meet in our homes or at the church or something on a Sunday night or a Saturday morning or whatever. And that's our time as pastors to intentionally develop them spiritually, going where Jesus went with Peter with them, to say, how are you doing in your relationship with your wife and your children? Are you growing spiritually? How can we pray for you and help you? So that we're making sure that we're hitting both sides of that leadership development, spiritual development, and practical ministry training. We're just splitting it up and doing it in two different settings. Okay, and then number 3, and then we'll see if we have any more questions or thoughts. Number 3 is, what should be the focus of your small groups? What does your church need to grow in? I think I mentioned this already, but when we first started discipleship groups, we designed them to be primarily a place where relationships and community was built, but also tried to combine that with an emphasis on growth in biblical knowledge. And so that's where you kind of get the fundamentals of they're typically taking the previous week's sermon and discussing it and seeking to apply it to their lives and creating a community where they're holding each other accountable to the things that they've discussed, while also including in that not only that discussion element, but also the element of taking time to share and pray for one another, to deepen those relationships with one another. So it's kind of almost like a catch-all in a certain sense, but I would say the thrust of these groups really embodies that community more than any one of the other elements. Thoughts or questions on 1, 2, or 3 as it relates to our church?
Yeah, could you explain a little bit point 2 under section 2, where it said formal trainings geared around leading faithfully happen quarterly on Vision Sunday mornings. I'm curious what you mean by Vision Sunday mornings.
Okay. I assumed I would get that question, so maybe I should have just answered it from the beginning. But yeah, so the way that we do continue to keep the vision of our church in front of our people is on a quarterly basis, 4 times a year, we take what we call a Vision Sunday. And what we do on Vision Sunday is we take one of our 7 core values and we preach on that core value. And then we also do other things that we feel like bind us together, like we'll take communion. We do that once a month on the first Sunday, but all of our Vision Sundays fall on the first Sunday. So we're taking communion together. We're reminding the church of what binds us together and the values that we have and the centrality on the gospel. And then during those breakout times where half the church goes to their D group and children's ministry, we will pull our leaders, our D group leaders, out of that time and train them separately. And then all of their groups go to a combined teaching time where they're being taught on a core value or being updated about missions-oriented things and things like that. So we utilize our Sunday mornings so we don't have to add another meeting for these leaders. We just take them out of that time and train them during that hour and 10 minutes that they're normally leading their D group 4 times a year. Does that make sense? Okay. Other questions or thoughts?
Yeah, I'm just kind of curious if you had an older woman in your church who wanted to train younger women whose moms are in school. Could I start a small group on a Tuesday morning? Does that fit somewhere, or how would you handle that?
Yeah, I would love for a woman to come to me and say that instead of me having to tap somebody on the shoulder and say, I think this is needed. I'd love to empower people in that way. And I would say for our context, I would say the answer to that would be absolutely yes. And we've thought about the possibility of, right now all of our D groups are divided by life stage and they're mixed. So it's typically spouses or single guys and single gals all in the same group. We have thought about in the future possibly the necessity of doing like a women's only and men's only group. Which would kind of embrace, I think, what you're talking about. But yeah, I would see there being an avenue, at least in our church's setting, to say, Irma wanted to lead a group like this, and we would put her in that position over that group of ladies and train her in the same way we're training the others. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, but it's also like, it does seem fairly limiting in the sense that it's always Sunday mornings, like no other.
Oh, I see. You were talking more about like the
Well, no,
weekday.
it's both and.
Yeah.
It's like the idea, it's all geared towards men in leadership, the way you've laid it out, and it's all geared towards Sunday morning, so it's kind of both questions.
Yeah, for our context, at least theologically, we're typically not putting ladies in that position when it's in a mixed group. And so if she was going to lead a group of ladies, of moms or whatever, she could do that on Sunday mornings, and that's probably the best time to do it because they have free childcare. But then also they would be more than welcome to meet outside of a Sunday morning as well. So these groups are, we say that in the culture of our church, most people are going to participate on a Sunday morning because they're already there for worship. And so that's when these groups normally meet together. They have the freedom to go above and beyond that, and we encourage them to meet outside of Sunday mornings as well. And so there's the ability for that to happen.
So, also out of curiosity, like, the way you've described your service, it sounds like you have pretty strong buy-in for people to attend both services. Because I've been in other churches that had multiple services, and people oftentimes tended to go to one or the other, and then they're out the door. So.
Yeah, I feel like that's a grace of God, to be honest with you, because, Fairlawn, I think it's, when I talked about it being a part of the DNA, I really think it is. Like, we have an immense amount of buy-in from our adults. I think that most churches, it's like, if you can get adults to be involved in a small group like that, even on a Sunday morning when they're already there, it's like 30% of the church's attendance or something. Fairlawn is probably in the 60 to 70 percentile. And that's what I mean by it's ingrained in these people that this is part of what we do when we come to church. And so for us to try to take that and exclusively put it on a weeknight would be like worse than pulling teeth. Okay, let me press through these last three, and then I'll take some final questions and answers. I was actually sitting in Caleb Reed's multiplication breakout yesterday and realized as I was thinking back over this that I was like, I was never told how much time I actually have. And so I prepped my material not realizing what the time constraints were, but I don't want to press too far into free time here, which is barreling down on us. So let me just cover these last three quickly. We'll take some quick questions and answers, and then I'll be available if you want to have a personal conversation. Okay, so number 4, what values should your small group ministry be oriented around? Context-specific question, what core values does your church operate under? Which of these values do you want your small group ministry to embody? So we have 7 core values as a church, and you can see them listed there. I won't read them all. The 4 that are underlined are the ones that create the guardrails for our discipleship group ministry. Gospel-focused teaching, gospel-fueled prayer, gospel-centered community, and gospel-driven discipleship. And you can already see the way that some of those elements represent themselves in terms of the things that we're doing as groups. We're studying the previous week's sermon, gospel-focused teaching. We're praying together, gospel-fueled prayer. We're sharing life. We're holding each other accountable, gospel-centered community, for the purpose of gospel-driven discipleship, making disciples who make disciples. So these are the core values that we continually preach to our leaders. These are the guardrails. These are the things that we want you guys thinking about when you decide what events you're going to put on, what studies you're going to do, how you're going to structure your groups, what they're going to do, when they meet, We want you intentionally thinking about these values of the church to see how you can greater embody them as individual small groups. Number 5, when should your small groups meet? I think we've been over this already. Ours meet on Sunday mornings. They're required to meet on Sunday mornings, and then they're encouraged to meet occasionally during the week or once a month, twice a month, whatever they feel is best for their specific group. And then number 6, how should the small groups be divided? We chose to divide our D groups based on life stage, and that was partially because that was carryover from the previous structure, and so the people were already used to that and really enjoyed it and loved it, and I think that's probably part of the high buy-in. Now I'll say that there are definitely cons to doing life stage only that cuts into the multi-general nature of the church that we want to embrace. That was just something that we were willing to give up at that point. But I will say that there are a couple of groups that have actually morphed into multi-generational groups. We don't require anybody to go to any certain group, so if you're 70, you can go to the post-high group that are 20 to 25 if you want. We don't require anybody to slide into a specific place. And so out of that, some multi-generational groups have already formed, and we plan to create some more groups in that vein as well. Okay, any questions or thoughts on these last four points here? Oh, you're gonna make Matt run, man.
I've appreciated kind of the contextual idea of this. In our church, we're a small church. We have a really good buy-in to Sunday school on Sunday morning, like 90% plus. But as far as trying to do something during the week, which is what we've used as kind of a small group time period, do you guys meet during the week at all? Is there like a Wednesday night program that you guys do? And if so, what would that look like?
Yeah, so Wednesday nights is chiefly our junior high ministry and youth ministry that are meeting. And there'll also be occasional, like some of our D groups will do men's and women's studies on, that's their own initiative. We're not telling them to do that. Often because they're dropping their kids off for youth and they want something to do for 2 hours, so they'll go every other week. The ladies will meet 1 week out of that group, the men will meet the next week, that kind of a thing. In the past, we've also utilized Wednesdays for other adult education classes because it's really hard to do that on a Sunday morning with mirroring services, which again, I'm over kind of that whole sphere of the church. And so we've also used Wednesday evenings as an opportunity to train just the broader church in specific classes and things like that. But it's most often, if you come to Fairlawn on a Wednesday night, you're going to see a lot of youth. That's who dominates the church in that way. We'll often do prayer nights once a month, prayer and worship, things like that. So.
Thank you. I was just thinking about the idea of you saying it'd be like pulling teeth. And maybe we should focus on the things that we're doing well and then expanding the things that people are interested in. I don't know. This has made me think. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I mean when I say consider the normal rhythms of your church life and figure out how to put your small group ministry in a place, excuse me, where there's going to be the most participation and the most buy-in in that way. I think that there is sometime, like in terms of when you're meeting, I think that there could be some things that it's somewhat neutral in my mind. Like meeting Sunday mornings for small groups is not necessarily better or worse, morally speaking, than meeting on a Wednesday or a Tuesday or whatever. But there are pros and cons to both. But more often than not, we've seen that it's typically best to follow those regular rhythms that already exist. Any other thoughts or questions? All right, well, I really appreciate you guys sitting in. Again, I'll be here floating around, love to answer any more specific questions that I can for you. Let me just pray to close us out for you guys and for your ministries and what you'll take away for your small groups.